The worn teddy bear appeared on the park swings, as if placed carefully for discovery. My son, Thomas, found it, his face lighting up with a joy that only a new, unexpected treasure can bring. The bear was worse for wear, one eye missing, its fur matted and faded, but Thomas adored it instantly. His mother and I exchanged glances. We didn't want him keeping it. Something about its dilapidated condition, its vacant stare, sparked a primal something inside me. When we tried to distract him, to steer him toward his other toys, he erupted. A scream tore from his throat, a sound so intense, so piercing, it defied his small frame. We recoiled, handing the bear back immediately. From then on, the bear was everything. Thomas ate with it, slept with it, carried it everywhere. His other toys lay forgotten in the toy box. A constant undercurrent of discomfort ran through the house. We tried to reason with him, to suggest other activities, but the bear was his world, his constant companion. One evening, I stood outside Thomas's bedroom door. A low murmur drifted out. I assumed he was babbling, lost in his own imaginative world. Then a second voice, raspy and unfamiliar, joined the conversation. My blood turned to ice. I pushed the door open. Thomas sat on the floor, the bear propped up in front of him. He was alone. I asked who was he talking to, my voice a strained whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and innocent. Just to Teddy, he replied, then returned to his one-sided conversation. The situation escalated. Thomas began speaking of leaving. He told us with unsettling certainty that he had to go soon. Teddy, he said, had plans for him. His mother and I dismissed it as childish fantasy, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by an attachment to a tattered toy. We reassured ourselves that it was just a phase, an imaginative game he would soon outgrow. One night I checked on him before going to bed. His room was empty. The bedclothes were undisturbed. I turned on the light and found the bear was missing from its spot at the foot of the bed. Panic clawed at my throat. His mother and I searched everywhere, frantically, desperately. We tore the house apart, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. Thomas was gone, and so was the bear. The shift in my son was subtle, barely a ripple. Once a boundless ball of energy, he became reserved, almost spectral. His laughter, once the soundtrack of our small house, faded into silence. He avoided the basement with an almost primal fear, his eyes widening whenever I mentioned laundry or storage. Sounds rose from below, scrapes, soft thuds, a dragging noise that made my teeth ache. Each time I descended the wooden steps, flashlight in hand, I found nothing amiss. The concrete floor was bare, the shelves undisturbed, the old boxes stacked just as I left them. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, mocking my anxieties. His sleep became troubled. Night after night I would find him standing by my bed, his small body trembling. He couldn't articulate his fear, only point silently towards the basement door. I started leaving the hall light on, a meager comfort against the unseen terrors that plagued him. Desperate, I contacted a foundation specialist. He arrived one morning, all business and measuring tools. He spent hours examining the walls, muttering about settling and hairline cracks. Finally, he pointed to a section of the basement wall, obscured by an old water heater. He tapped it, the sound echoing hollowly. Behind the paneling, we discovered a passage, a dark, narrow tunnel excavated into the earth, leading away from the house, disappearing into the dense woods behind our property. The air from the tunnel was cold, stagnant, carrying a scent of mildew and something indefinable. I called the authorities. The scene that followed was a blur of uniforms, flashing lights, and hushed voices. The tunnel revealed a collection of discarded items: a child's teddy bear, a single sneaker, a faded photograph of a smiling girl. Each object felt like a punch to the gut, a silent testament to stolen innocence. The investigation uncovered evidence of someone who had been near the edge. The authorities spoke of patterns, of a methodical nature, of calculated actions. They spoke of someone who had observed, planned, and waited. My son remained withdrawn. The hall light stayed on every night. The basement door stayed bolted. I held him a little tighter, a little longer. He never spoke of what he might have known. He didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes, a silent horror, a story untold, a presence escaped. The walk home began the same as always. The streetlights were coming on, painting the pavement in pools of yellow light. Houses stood silent behind hedges and fences. Each night the route from work was the same, a well-worn path through quiet streets, Then one evening, something felt different. A sense at the edge of my awareness, a prickle on my skin. I glanced behind. A figure was there, further back on the pavement. Just someone walking home, I reasoned. London is full of people, but the next night the feeling returned. And again there he was, the same figure, keeping the same distance, not quite close, but always there. Dark coat, indistinct features under the streetlights. I increased my pace a little. He did too. My heart began to tap a little faster against my ribs, just my imagination running away with me, I thought. I continued on, trying to ignore the prickling feeling on my neck. The pattern continued. Every evening, emerging from the office, there he would be, starting his walk at the same moment as me, always a set distance behind. It became a constant awareness in my mind, a knot tightening in my stomach as soon as I left work. One night I stopped at a shop window, pretending to look at the display. My reflection showed him briefly in the glass behind me, pausing a short distance back, waiting. It was him. It wasn't just coincidence. A cold dread washed over me. Reaching my front door was always a moment of sharp relief. The click of the lock, the bolt sliding home, these sounds were my sanctuary. Inside, the four walls felt like a haven, shutting out the unseen presence from the street. Days turned into weeks. The walks home became a torment. The figure was always there, a shadow mirroring my path. I began to avoid looking back, knowing he would be there. The knowledge was enough. The knot in my stomach became a permanent resident. Then came the envelope. It was in the letterbox when I collected the post one morning. Plain white, no stamp, simply pushed through the slot. My name and address typed neatly on the front. A strange chill went through me even before I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was of me, walking down the street. And then I noticed something worse. My face, and my eyes especially, were scratched out, viciously scored with dark lines. The paper was torn slightly at the edges, as if handled roughly. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to shake as I dropped the photo onto the table as if it burned. Where had this come from? Who would do this? The figure. It had to be him. He wasn't just following me, he was watching me, taking pictures. A wave of nausea rose inside me. Each day after, more photos arrived, each one of me in different places, different clothes. Leaving for work, waiting at the bus stop, buying groceries, every photo the same. My face savagely scratched out. The collection grew, each one a fresh stab of icy fear. Sleep became fractured, haunted by images of dark figures and scratched faces. Every creak of the house at night jumped to my attention. Every rustle outside the window made me freeze. I drew the curtains tighter, checked the locks again and again. The flat felt less like a haven now, more like a cage. Going outside became unthinkable. Work called. Wondering where I was, I couldn't explain. How could I explain? I was trapped inside, prisoner in my own home by an unseen terror. Days blurred into each other, marked only by the arrival of the post and the new scratched photograph. The outside world faded into a distant hum. One morning I woke with a start, an odd feeling, a sense of something being different, something being wrong. It wasn't the usual morning anxiety. It was sharper, more immediate. I sat up in bed, scanning the room. Everything seemed normal. Sunlight was filtering through the gap in the curtains. Then I noticed it. On my bedside table, next to my glasses and book, another photograph, not pushed through the letterbox, not delivered with the morning post, just there on my bedside table. My hand trembled as I reached for it. Another white envelope, inside another photo, but this one was different. This one was taken in the dark, grainy, indistinct, illuminated only by the faint glow of the digital clock on my bedside table. It was a picture of my bedroom, and in the bed under the covers was me, sleeping. My face in this photo was scratched out too, but the chilling detail was not that. It was the fact that the photo had to have been taken from inside my room. While I was asleep, he had been inside. We settled around the fire, the flames snapping merrily against the encroaching dark. Stories circulated, tales designed to send shivers down spines. We enjoyed the thrill of manufactured frights, the security of knowing it was all just harmless fun. Then he appeared. He emerged from the trees, stepping into the firelight like a creature blinked into existence. He swayed, his clothes ripped and muddied. Scratches marked his arms and face, drawing beads of crimson. He looked completely lost, genuinely distressed. We moved to help, concern replacing the earlier joviality. He spoke in hushed tones, explaining he had been wandering for days, lost, injured. He accepted our offered food and water with a desperate eagerness. We made space for him by the fire. sharing our meager supplies. There was something about him, an undercurrent to his presence that disturbed the easy atmosphere. But we put it down to his ordeal, his obvious exhaustion. As night deepened, his behavior altered. He became quiet, withdrawn. He stared into the woods, at the black shapes beyond the firelight, with an intensity that made your skin crawl. He muttered, words indistinguishable under his breath. He refused the offer of a sleeping bag, remaining perched by the edge of the fire, his gaze fixed on the trees. Sleep evaded everyone. The jovial mood had evaporated, replaced by a shared, unspoken apprehension. Morning dawned grey and unwelcoming. A sense of something being terribly amiss permeated the air. One of us was gone. Empty sleeping bag, no sign. Panic flared. We searched the immediate area, calling out, receiving only silence in return. The stranger remained by the fire, his expression unreadable. Driven by a rising tide of fear and anger, we approached him, demanding answers. He remained silent. One of us reached out, touched his arm, examining the supposed injuries, the faint red streaks on his skin smeared at the touch. Fake. The scratches, merely lines drawn on his skin. His eyes shifted, a flicker of something cold within their depths. We turned back towards the trees, a chilling comprehension dawning. He was gone too, vanished, leaving behind only the dying embers of the fire and the terrifying awareness of something unknown lurking just beyond the edge of the light, in the silent, watchful woods. The trail was familiar, a comforting thread winding through the towering pines. I'd walked it countless times, each solo trek a necessary communion with the wild. I prided myself on my self-reliance, my ability to navigate the rugged terrain, to read the subtle language of the forest. This time, however, something prickled at the edge of my awareness, a disquiet I couldn't quite place. I pressed on, the crunch of my boots on the packed earth the only sound. I reached for my camera, an old faithful companion, and snapped a picture of the vista unfolding before me, a panorama of jagged peaks piercing a brilliant sky. Later, reviewing the image, I noticed a blur. It wasn't the blur of hasty photography, but something else. A distortion in the trees to the left, as if the very fabric of the forest was wavering. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens. The next day the disquiet intensified. It was in the way the birds fell quiet as I passed, the way the wind seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. I began taking more pictures, documenting the journey, trying to anchor myself to reality. Each photo revealed a growing sense of something amiss. Another blurred image, this one of a gnarled tree, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes. In the background, a figure, distant, indistinct, but undeniably there. Someone standing among the trees. I zoomed in, the pixels blurring into an abstract mess, but the feeling remained. Someone was there. Fear began to gnaw at me, a cold knot in my stomach. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was just paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed, of unseen eyes boring into my back. I stopped frequently, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Only trees, rocks, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I set up camp that night, a small fire, my only solace against the encroaching darkness. The forest pressed in around me, the silence broken only by the crackling flames. I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I gripped my camera, its cold metal a small comfort. I took a picture of the fire, the dancing flames casting eerie patterns on the surrounding trees. In the reflection of the lens, I could see my face, gaunt and terrified. Another picture of the darkness beyond the firelight, and again a figure in the distance, always further away, but I could never find them. The following day, I was running. Panic had taken root, driving me forward with frantic energy. I didn't know what I was running from, only that I had to escape. The camera was my only record, a fragmented narrative of my descent into terror. More pictures, each one more disturbing than the last. Blurry shots of the forest floor, my own trembling hands, glimpses of something just beyond the frame. The figure was always there, lurking in the periphery, a silent, malevolent presence. I stumbled, fell, scrambled back to my feet. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees contorting into monstrous shapes. I took another picture, my last. The camera slipped from my grasp, landing on the ground. The shutter clicked. The image captured was from a low angle, the leaves and dirt filling the frame. Above, a dark shape loomed. That was it. Weeks later I was found at a ranger station, miles from where I had vanished. I was emaciated, disoriented, with no memory of the intervening weeks. The search party had found my camp, my gear, and my camera. The images on the camera were disturbing, unsettling, a record of a journey into madness. They were a puzzle, a haunting enigma with no solution. They never found anything else. I was back, but a part of me remained in that forest, lost in the blurred images and the silent pursuit. I don't reflect on it, I just am. The old house breathed secrets. I purchased it for next to nothing, a steal in a market gone mad. Its previous owner had vanished, leaving behind dust, silence, and the lingering scent of decay. I reveled in the solitude, eager to strip away the grime and reveal the hidden beauty I knew resided beneath. Renovation began immediately. I attacked the peeling wallpaper, the stained carpets, the warped floorboards with a fervor bordering on obsession. It was beneath these floorboards, in the main living room, that I discovered the trapdoor. It was camouflaged expertly, almost invisibly amongst the aged wood. Only a slight difference in the grain, a subtle discoloration, gave it away. Curiosity, a dangerous beast, gnawed at me. I had to know. With considerable effort, I pried the trapdoor open. A musty odor arose from the darkness below, a smell of stagnant water and forgotten things. I retrieved a flashlight from my toolbox and aimed its beam into the abyss. A staircase descended into earth. Each step groaned in protest as I made my way down, deeper and deeper, the air growing colder with each footfall. The beam of my flashlight danced across the damp walls, revealing rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. Then I was in the room. It was larger than I anticipated, stretching further than the dimensions of the house above would suggest. My flashlight struggled to illuminate the far corners, the darkness there seeming to press in, to resist the intrusion of light. Children's drawings adorned the walls. Crude figures, rendered in crayon and charcoal, depicted stick figures, smiling suns, and houses with disproportionately large windows. But there was something inherently disturbing about them. A flatness, a lack of perspective that belied their childish creation. Old toys littered the floor, rag dolls with missing eyes, wooden trains with broken wheels, teddy bears torn and disemboweled. Each object radiated an aura of sadness, of abandonment, of something far more sinister. My breath hitched as my flashlight beam settled on the bed frame. Rusted, skeletal, it stood against one wall. Leather restraints, cracked and brittle with age, were still attached to the four posts. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, knocking over a pile of wooden blocks. Their clatter echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space. I needed to get out. But then the missing person reports. They were pinned to the wall next to the bed frame, newspaper clippings yellowed and brittle. Each featured a photograph of a child, their innocent faces frozen in time, names, dates, locations, all meticulously recorded. A cold dread settled deep in my bones. I scrambled back up the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had to call the police. This couldn't wait. Back in the living room, I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely dial. The police answered quickly, and I spilled out my discovery, my voice a shaky whisper. They assured me officers would be dispatched immediately. Relief washed over me, swiftly followed by a renewed sense of terror. What had I stumbled upon? What horrors had transpired beneath my newly acquired home? I paced the room, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sending shivers down my spine. The doorbell rang. My breath caught in my throat. They were here. Relief flooded me. I rushed to the door, eager to hand over this nightmare to the authorities. I swung the door open. Standing on my porch was an old man. He was frail, his face etched with wrinkles, his eyes sunken and shadowed. He wore a faded brown suit, its fabric worn and threadbare. He was unfamiliar. It wasn't the police. He regarded me with an unsettling intensity, his gaze piercing, possessive. A flicker of something unreadable danced within his eyes. A smile stretched across his lips, a grotesque parody of warmth. It did not reach his eyes. His voice was a raspy whisper, almost inaudible. The park was quiet, unusually so for a Tuesday afternoon. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soft, whispering sound that did little to alleviate the stillness. I walked along the paved path, enjoying the solitude, the escape from the incessant clamor of the city. That's when I noticed him. A small child standing alone near the old oak tree. He was dressed in a faded blue coat, much too large for his frame, and his dark hair was disheveled. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring at the ground. A wave of concern washed over me. It didn't seem right for a child to be alone in the park like that. I approached him cautiously, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. I asked the boy if he's okay and where his parents were. He didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the earth. I tried again, repeating my questions, but still nothing, and it was as if I were speaking to a statue. Growing increasingly worried, I decided I needed to find someone to help, perhaps a park ranger or another adult who might know the boy. I turned to walk towards the park entrance, intending to locate someone who could assist. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but when I turned back to check on the child, he was gone, vanished. The spot under the oak tree was empty. I scanned the area, my heart beginning to race. The park was open, with no obvious place for a child to hide so quickly. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Where could he have gone? I rushed to the oak tree, searching for any sign of him. Footprints in the dirt, a dropped toy, anything. But there was nothing. The ground was smooth, undisturbed. The only evidence of his presence was the lingering sense of disquiet that permeated the spot where he had stood. Shaken, I continued towards the park entrance, determined to find someone who could help. That's when I noticed it, a missing person flyer taped to a lamppost. The picture was grainy, slightly faded, but the face was unmistakable. It was the boy from under the oak tree. My blood ran cold. The flyer stated his name and age. It also indicated the date he had gone missing several weeks prior. I pulled out my mobile and dialed the police, my hands trembling. I reported what happened, describing the boy, the location, everything. The officer on the other end of the line sounded skeptical, but he assured me they would investigate. Days passed. I revisited the park, hoping for some explanation, some sign that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The police searched the area but found no trace of the child. They reviewed security camera footage from the park's perimeter, but there was nothing. The cameras hadn't captured any image of the boy either entering or leaving the park. It was as if he had never been there. The police investigation stalled. The missing person flyer remained on the lamppost, a constant, chilling reminder of what I'd seen. I tried to put it out of my mind, to return to my normal life, but I couldn't. The image of the boy, standing alone under the oak tree, haunted me. One evening I decided to walk through the park again, hoping to find some peace. The sun setting, the light filtering through the trees created an amber glow. The park was deserted, the silence even more profound. I reached the oak tree, the spot where I had noticed him. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what occurred. How could a child vanish so quickly? How could security cameras miss him entirely? And why was he there, weeks after he had gone missing? A whisper of breeze moved, rustling the leaves. As I turned to leave, my gaze fell upon something partially hidden within the roots of the old oak tree. It was a small, faded blue coat, one worn by the child in the missing poster. I opened the album, leather-bound, worn at the edges. It was a relic from a past that felt both intimately mine and impossibly distant. Childhood, a simpler time, supposedly. I settled into my chair, the old leather creaking in protest, and began to turn the pages. There I was, a gap-toothed grin splitting my face on my 5th birthday. Balloons bobbed, a cheap plastic tablecloth adorned the picnic table, and my mum beamed at me from behind a towering cake. Standard fare. I flipped the page. Another birthday, a year older, the same gaggle of kids, slightly taller. A deflated football lay discarded on the grass. I smiled, a gentle tug at the corner of my lips. Then I noticed it. In the periphery of the shot, lurking at the edge of the garden fence, was a figure. Tall, dark, indistinct. It seemed almost like a trick of the light, a convergence of shrubbery and fence posts. But there was a definite human form. It wasn't one of my parents. They were both accounted for. None of the other parents either. A stranger? Perhaps. Kids' parties attract all sorts. I shrugged and turned the page. Another photo. This one was taken outside our house. Mum, Dad and I posed awkwardly on the doorstep, grinning like loons. It was Christmas, judging by the gaudy decorations. And there it was again. Across the street, this date, half hidden behind a parked car, still indistinct but undeniably present. a smudge of darkness against the bright winter day, the shape of a person, but not a person I recognized. My pulse picked up a notch. Coincidence, surely? But a cold prickle crawled up my spine. I leafed through the album faster now, my eyes scanning the backgrounds of the photos. There it was, in a reflection on a shop window during our seaside holiday, partially obscured by trees in a park during a family picnic. Always there, lurking at the periphery, a silent, dark observer. With each turn of the page, the figure seemed to gain definition. The indeterminate blob resolved itself into a more definite form, a tall, gaunt silhouette. The angle of the head suggested it was facing me, or rather facing the camera, facing me. A knot began to tighten in my stomach. I shuffled through the photos, now desperate to reach the end. There was the school play, my awkward rendition of a shepherd. There it was, standing by the side exit of the hall. Then there was the family trip to the zoo, me standing next to a monkey cage, and it, further down the path, standing alone. The figure was undoubtedly getting nearer. The photos became scarcer towards the end of the album. My parents weren't big on documenting teenage angst, I suppose, but there was one last photo, my 16th birthday. I remember that day. I'd spent most of it locked in my room, sulking about something or other. My parents had coaxed me outside for 5 minutes to take a photo. I remembered the forced smile, the teenage scowl barely concealed. And there it was, no longer a distant shadow, no longer a figure lurking in the background. It was right behind me, standing just at the edge of the garden. The dark form was clearer than ever. I could make out the long, spindly limbs, the featureless face tilted towards me, and then I saw the hand, a skeletal hand reaching out, almost touching my shoulder. The album slipped from my grasp, landing on the floor with a muted thud. The photograph stared up at me, the dark figure looming. I stared back, frozen, a wave of icy dread washing over me. My breath hitched. I could hear the frantic thumping of my heart in my ears. The lamp flickered. Then all went dark. The endless ribbon of asphalt unspooled before me, swallowed by the hungry maw of night. My rig ate up the miles, its engine a steady, comforting drone against the isolating silence. Headlights cut twin swathes through the inky black, painting the scrubby desert landscape in fleeting grayscale. That's when I noticed her. A lone figure huddled by the roadside, swallowed by the vast emptiness. A woman, her form fragile and small beneath the immense indifferent sky. I couldn't just leave her there. Pulling over, the gravel crunched beneath my tires as I brought the truck to a halt. She approached cautiously, her face obscured by darkness. As she drew nearer, details emerged. Pale skin, dark hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wide and deep-set. An unsettling stillness radiated from her. She slipped into the passenger seat, buckling the belt with trembling hands. I offered water. She accepted, her fingers brushing mine, icy despite the desert heat. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the engine's rumble. I glanced at her, hoping for some explanation, some indication of what had brought her to this forsaken place. She stared straight ahead, lost in some internal landscape. Resigned, I shifted gears and pulled back onto the highway. Hours passed in silence. The miles blurred. The only sound came from the road and the steady beating of my own heart. I chanced to look at her again. She hadn't shifted, hadn't blinked. An odd sensation prickled at the back of my neck. Finally, a beacon of light pierced the darkness. A truck stop, a haven of greasy food and lukewarm coffee. "I'm stopping for a break," I announced. No response. "You want anything?" Still nothing. I pulled into a parking space, the hiss of the air brakes a brief intrusion. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt and exited the cab. I watched her walk toward the restroom building, her figure swallowed by the glare of the fluorescent lights. I stretched, relieved to be out of the cab. A cup of coffee, a stale donut, anything to break the monotony. Before heading inside, I checked my mirrors, ensuring the trailer was properly aligned. She wasn't there. No one was there. The parking lot stretched, empty and shimmering under the harsh lights. The restroom door remained shut. I paused, puzzled. Maybe she was already inside. I shrugged, attributing her disappearance to road weariness. I went inside, ordered coffee, ate the donut, but something gnawed at me. I finished my coffee, the artificial warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within me. I walked back outside, scanning the parking lot. Still empty, the restroom door still firmly shut. I returned to my truck, the silence amplifying the disquiet. The seat where I sat remained empty, the seatbelt neatly retracted. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion. started my engine, the air horn a lonely blast into the desert night. A week later, I found myself at another truck stop, miles away, sharing a table with a fellow driver. We swapped stories of close calls, bad weather, and the strange encounters that came with life on the road. I found myself recounting the tale of the woman on the highway, describing her pale face, her dark eyes, her unsettling quietness. The other driver listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. When I finished, he stared at me for a long moment. He then spoke, his words a jolt to my system. He told me about a woman matching the description I'd provided, who was discovered near that very truck stop. It was over a year ago. He added that she had been a victim. The fog arrived without warning, a solid grey wall consuming the horizon. It moved fast, faster than any natural weather I had witnessed, swallowing the familiar coastline. Panic bloomed in my chest as the tendrils reached the edge of town, erasing houses, trees, everything. Visibility dropped to near nothing. The world shrank to a small circle of damp grey around me. An absolute stillness descended. The usual crash of waves, the cry of gulls, the distant drone of traffic, all gone, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. Then came the shapes. Vague and indistinct, they appeared within the fog, just at the edge of what I could perceive. Humanoid perhaps, but distorted, elongated, somehow not quite right. They drifted rather than walked, gliding through the dense air with an unsettling grace. I recoiled, backing into my house, locking the door and drawing the curtains. Peeking through a gap in the fabric, I strained to see. One of the shapes pauses near a neighbour's house. Mrs. Abernathy, her face etched with sorrow since her husband passed, steps onto her porch. Apprehension coils in my stomach. She is drawn to it. Drawn by what? I cannot fathom, but she walks toward the figure, disappearing into the fog. Vanishes as if she never existed. A cold dread washes over me. This is more than a strange weather pattern. This is something evil, something predatory. I wanted to alert the others, to warn them. But who would believe me, and what could we do? Days blurred into a nightmare of grey. Trapped inside, I rationed my food, listening to the unnatural quiet, broken only by the mournful tones carried on the strange mist. The shapes became more frequent, appearing outside my windows just beyond the glass, their form shifting, solidifying, then dissolving back into the fog. I began to sense things. Not see, not quite, but perceive. Flickers of memory, phantom sensations. My mother's garden, the scent of her roses, the feel of her hand in mine. A profound sense of longing resonated within me, an ache for something lost, something just beyond my reach. It was a siren song, calling me toward the fog. One afternoon, the form outside my window changed. It coalesced. I recognized the faded dress, the familiar curve of a shoulder, the way the head tilts. My mother. Dread mingles with intense yearning. It can't be, it isn't possible. I stumbled back, heart pounding, breath catching in my throat. This is a twisted trick, a cruel manipulation. But the longing intensifies, overwhelming my fear, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Sleep offered little respite. Dreams were fragmented, filled with images of swirling grey, of half-seen faces, of reaching hands. I awoke each dawn more exhausted, more vulnerable. The pull toward the fog grew stronger, a magnetic force drawing me toward its embrace. Food became unappetizing. Water tasted metallic. My thoughts grew muddled. My resolve weakened. I found myself standing by the door, hand on the knob, the image of my mother imprinted on my mind. Another figure appears, different this. Tall, gaunt, its features indistinct in the gloom. It stands near the old lighthouse, its beam rendered useless by the all-encompassing mist. I watch as a young man, barely more than a boy, walks toward it. He hesitates for a moment, then steps into the fog. Gone. The shapes are not just luring the grieving or the lonely, they take anyone. I retreated from the door, collapsing onto the floor, clutching my head. I had to resist. I had to fight this insidious force, a battle waged solely within my own mind. I focused on other memories, on the feel of sunshine on my skin, the taste of salt on the air, the laughter of children playing. It was a constant struggle, a tug-of-war between rationality and primal longing. Some days I managed to hold the darkness at bay. Other days I felt myself slipping, succumbing to the whispers, drawn ever closer to the encroaching grey. Then, one morning, I awoke to find the fog inside my house. It seeped under the door, through the cracks in the windows, filling the rooms with its spectral presence. The shapes are no longer outside, they are with me. A chorus of phantom memories echoes around me. I struggle to discern what is real and what is illusion. The figure of my mother appears before me, beckoning. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now hold an empty light. I reach for her hand and she smiles. An icy cold emanates from her touch, but I hesitate. Other figures emerge from the fog, faces I recognize, a childhood friend, a beloved teacher, my grandfather, all smiling, all welcoming, all dead. They want me to join them, and I want to. A profound weariness settles over me. The fight is exhausting, the loneliness unbearable. I take another step forward, and the fog swirls about me, obscuring everything else. One last thought flickers through my mind. Escape. But the thought is weak, a dying ember in the all-consuming grey. I allow myself to sink, to drift, to surrender to the beckoning embrace. The figures surround me, their smiles widening, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light. And as the fog closes in completely, I feel nothing. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway buzzed, a constant, irritating drone that matched the anxiety building in my chest. My rounds on the night shift were usually uneventful, a quiet shuffle between rooms, checking vitals, adjusting IV drips. But tonight the air felt different. Stale, static. Room 412? That's where the change began. Mrs. Abernathy, dementia, 90-something years etched onto a frail frame. She'd arrived a few weeks ago, another nameless face in the sea of suffering this place contained. Initially she was quiet, mostly unresponsive. Then came the whispers. At night, when the hospital hushed and the only sounds were machines and muffled footsteps, she would beckon me with a claw-like hand. Her eyes, milky with age, would fixate on me, boring into something deep inside. Then the whispers would begin. They were fragmented at the beginning, garbled sounds escaping paper-thin lips. As days passed, the whispers gained clarity, weaving together into chilling narratives. She spoke of fields, endless fields bathed in moonlight, ditches freshly dug and then filled, a glint of metal under the stars. These weren't the ramblings of a confused mind. Some coherence was there, a thread of story that slowly unwound, revealing a tapestry of horror. She spoke of disappearances, decades old, names I didn't recognize, dates I couldn't place. She revealed details, minute and gruesome, about those vanished souls, a silver locket, a chipped tooth, details too specific, too dark to be simple fantasies. I initially attributed it to the disease ravaging her mind. Dementia does terrible things, conjuring up images and memories from the ether. I dismissed it as the product of a fading brain, seeking to fill the empty spaces with twisted creations. One night, compelled by morbid curiosity, I looked them up. The names, the dates, the disappearances Mrs. Abernathy had babbled about. The local library held dusty archives of old newspapers, their pages brittle and yellowed with age. The names matched, the dates were exact. Then I found something else, a detail she'd mentioned, a silver locket engraved with the initials EB. One of the missing women, according to a police report, was wearing such a locket. It was never recovered. Another case. A man vanished from a nearby town in 1958. Mrs. Abernathy had described him with startling precision, mentioning a chipped tooth, a detail never released to the public. A cold dread settled over me as I continued my research. There were more, so many more. Unsolved disappearances spanning decades, all connected by the disturbing details whispered by the frail old woman in room 412. I started avoiding her. I diverted my rounds, asking other nurses to check on her. The whispers haunted me, slithering into my thoughts, poisoning my dreams. Sleep became a battlefield of images, moonlit fields, shallow graves, glittering metal. But I couldn't stay away. A morbid fascination pulled me back, and compulsion to understand the darkness emanating from her. There were questions that needed answers, questions I was terrified to ask. I returned to room 412, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the blinking monitors beside her bed. She lay still, her breathing shallow and raspy. I stood there, frozen, staring at her. Her eyes fluttered open. They locked onto me, filled with an ancient knowing. A whisper escaped her lips, barely audible. "They never found them all, you know." She drifted back to sleep, leaving me standing there, paralyzed by the implications of her words. How many others were there? What other secrets were buried alongside the forgotten victims? I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The sterile environment offered no answers, only the sterile scent of disinfectant and the constant maddening hum of the machines. I left the room, the dread a tangible entity beside me. The hallway stretched out before me, long and empty, each shadow seeming to writhe with unseen terrors. I continued my rounds, but the hospital felt different now, colder, more sinister. Later, while reviewing patient charts, I found an old photograph tucked into Mrs. Abernathy's file. It showed a young woman, no older than 20, standing in a field. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of life, but something about the photo made my skin crawl. It was the field, it looked familiar. It had the same slight depression in the land, the same distinctive tree line in the distance. It was one of the fields Mrs. Abernathy had described in her whispers. I stared at the photo, my mind reeling. The young woman's smile felt like a taunt, her youthful innocence a disturbing contrast to the darkness I now associated with her. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink was a single word: remember. Days turned into weeks. I continued to work, to function, but the whispers were always there, echoing in the back of my mind. Mrs. Abernathy remained in room 412, her condition unchanging. Sometimes she would whisper, other times she would simply stare, her eyes filled with an unfathomable sadness. Once, as I was leaving her room, I saw her frail hand twitch. She was holding something. When I leaned, that it was a small, tarnished object, a piece of metal. I couldn't see it clearly, but its glint in the dim light sent a shot of ice through my veins. The hospital continued its operations, oblivious to the darkness I now carried within me. The nurses bustled about, the doctors made their rounds, and the patients suffered in silence. But for me, everything had changed. I was trapped in a nightmare, bound to the secrets of a demented old woman.